Hi guys, so this is an introduction to poetry, and I've already done one on my podcast. So I'll put a link to the podcast below, and I hope that you can listen to it. And uh, this will be very similar, but perhaps I might include a few extra elements as well. And I hope that this will be the beginning of a series of videos on different aspects of poetry. I like to write poetry myself, so probably later on I will relate some of the things we said to some of my own poetry. Okay, so let's begin with the question, what is poetry? What is poetry? Well, poetry has many different definitions, and people have said many things about it over the centuries and millennia. One definition of poetry is the best words in the best order. It's not bad, actually, is it? It seems quite descriptive, the best words in the best order. However, hmm, maybe you could say the same thing about an engineering treatise. The writer of that wants to put the best words in the best order as well. So it's hardly a comprehensive description of what poetry is. We need to think a bit more precisely, perhaps, and think maybe of examples of what poetry is. It's when do you use poetry? Usually, we use poetry when something is very difficult to say, I would think. So, if something is fairly straightforward, or we want to write a simple narrative or a story, be creative in that way, we just write a short story or a novel. We turn to poetry when we have something intrinsically difficult to express. It's not easy, so we use a condensed form of language that makes use of a lot of imagery. Why do you use imagery? Because it's useful to say that something that's difficult to comprehend is like something else that's more comprehensible. Um, so poetry is usually a condensed form of language which speaks about something that is very difficult to explain. Um, and of course, we want to use the best language we can, and it should have a heightened emotional content in some kind of way. Should be full of emotion and yet controlled by the language. So I would say that a real poet has to have a real skill with language and also have something very interesting to say, but maybe even more than that, has to have an interesting emotional nature, because poetry describes inner emotions as much as anything else. So if you want to write about politics, you'd probably do it in a different form. Although there is plenty of political poetry as well, although I'm not sure it's always successful. So yeah, so poetry is about language, and it's about expressing difficult concepts in language, and it's about emotion. Usually there is specific point of view, right? There is the poet's point of view, not just talking about a difficult concept. Somehow this difficult concept is important to the poet. So concepts like love are traditional, beauty are traditional to poetry. So the writer needs to express his or her appreciation of someone, someone loved, a loved person. So uses heightened language, emotional language to do this, and yet it has to be controlled by strict use of the words. So yeah, there is a tendency now to think that anyone writes poetry and there's no problem. All you have to do is just sit down and write a few words on paper, however you feel like it, and that's poetry. Well, maybe it is in one way. If you want to simply express your opinion and show it to your friends and relatives, or release your emotions, let's say, rather than express your opinion. If you just want to release your emotions, then the catharsis has happened, presumably, and you feel better. Objective achieved. However, I think a real poet wants to do more than that. A real poet wants to speak to large groups of people, to society as a whole, to his people in his or her own country, people abroad, to write things that will probably last after the poet's death. So to do that, you really need to control language, and um, poetry is like anything else. It has rules that have to be learnt. And in particular, you need to learn the rules of the kind of poetry you want to write. So, um, T.S. Eliot, for example, he was a master of, I would say, almost all forms of past poetry, and he wrote critical essays which kind of created the taste by which his own poetry, very fragmentary and elusive, but based on the past tradition, is enjoyed. So, so yes, I think you really need to look at the past tradition in your particular area. If it's song lyrics, well, lyrics can be poetry too. So you have to look at the kind of songs that you like in order to write lyrics which are suitable for songs. Um, Bury my body down by the highway side so that my old evil spirit can catch a greyhound bus and ride. That's great poetry, actually, but it's not formal poetry or poetry that you'll find in a book of poems. It's lines from Robert Johnson, the blues man, and you can find language which suddenly rises to the level of poetry in many songs. So also Robert Burns, he wrote a lot of very simple lyrics which were designed to be fitted to traditional Scottish folk songs. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love is like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. A couple of beautiful similes there. My love is like a red rose. A red rose is always associated with love, and his love is like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. These examples will show that poetry, sincere, real poetry, does not need to be complicated. In fact, if it's about simple emotions, better to keep the language simple if you can as well, because then it's talking from heart to heart. But yeah, so the point is you need to really study the kind of poetry that you want to write, and at least have a basic grounding in probably the history of poetry, at least in your own country. Um, yeah, perhaps we can think about Sonnet by Shakespeare here to illustrate some of these points. So, not looking at it as a sonnet, not studying the sonnet, but just indicating how much Shakespeare knows about language and about the rules of his craft before he begins to pour his soul out into the content. So let's choose Sonnet 18, which is so famous. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? It begins with a question, right? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And then it goes on to kind of say, well, no, I don't think I will. Why? I don't think I will. And why? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. So summer is not perfect. Sometimes it's too hot. Doesn't last forever. and the loved one is more temperate, more stable. Summer's day is sometimes too hot, sometimes too cold, but somehow the loved one is uh, is better in that, is more stable, and will last longer than a summer's day. So these are that's the content, but these are four lines together like this with a certain pattern is called a quatrain. So this is a quatrain, four lines that relate to each other. How do they relate? Let's think about the number of syllables in each of these lines. If we count them, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? There are 10 syllables, right? 10 syllables. And all the lines have 10 syllables, in fact. And there could be a line with 9 or 11, but the base is 10. That is always returned to. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? So, can we say anything about the meter or the rhythm of these lines? Seems like it's based on unstressed, stressed syllables. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And in fact, that's right. This is called Iambic Pentameter in English poetry, and Shakespeare uses it all the time in his plays and in his poems. It's an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So if there are 10 syllables, there will be 5 of these units in each line. Each unit is called a foot. So there are 5 feet in every line of a sonnet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? We don't actually read it like that. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? But this is the underlying reality. It's said that this meter is the most common and conversational, natural in the English language, and Shakespeare uses it all the time. So we've seen that there are these 4 lines together are called a quatrain. We've seen that they have a particular meter, the iambic pentameter, with 10 syllables in each line. Is there anything else we can say about this? Well, it seems to rhyme, doesn't it? So, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaves have all too short a date. So the rhyming scheme here is A, B, A, B. And in fact, a sonnet is made up of 3 quatrains. That's 12 lines, like this. So 3 quatrains, 4, 4, 4, and the final 2 rhyming lines, which are called couplet, a couplet. So 3 quatrains and a couplet. That's a sonnet. And the poet, if he or she wants to write a sonnet, really needs to know about this form. You can't just sit down and say, okay, I'll write a sonnet. Okay, the only thing I know about a sonnet is it has 14 lines. That's not a good place to start. You should know everything about the rules of writing sonnets if you want to write one. And then later, if you want to break the rules somehow, then you can. But you have to know the rules, like everything else. You have to know the rules before you can break them. Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. So that's the second quatrain, the next 4 lines. So again, it's continuing with the idea that the loved one is better than the summer's day. Sometimes the sun is obscured by clouds. Sometimes it's too hot. So the answer to the original question, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, is not going very well, really. Shakespeare is giving many examples of why should not compare this person to a summer's day, because all the weaknesses or bad things about a summer's day, they are not shared by the loved ones. Somehow the loved one is more perfect than the summer's day, which will end quickly, which has many imperfections. The loved one does not have imperfections, will continue longer than a summer's day. So the answer seems to be no at the moment. And then he continues, but thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So that's a complete poem. That's the 3 quatrains, all with this rhyme scheme of A, B, C, D, C, D, C, D, E, F, and then final couplet, G, G, all in iambic pentameter with 10 syllables each line. The iambic pentameter is an unstressed syllable followed by stressed syllable. So Shakespeare has to know all this and make use of it before he even starts the sonnet. You might say that a sonnet is almost partly written before a word goes on the paper, because we know what the form is, we know kind of what the rhyme scheme will be, and so it creates a certain expectation. You can say that in a Platonic kind of way, the sonnet almost exists in an abstract form before the actual words are provided. So what's the answer then? How is the loved one better than the summer's day? The final 2 lines give the answer. So the summer's day is brief, it will come and go, and it's imperfect. However, the loved one will live forever in Shakespeare's poem, or at least as long as men can breathe and eyes can see. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So he's saying, as long as my people read my poem, your beauty is preserved forever in its lines. And so it lives forever. It lives longer than a summer's day, and you are forever perfect and beautiful in the poem. This is a very traditional kind of idea in the sonnets, based on the Middle Ages and courtly love and Renaissance ideas. Sonnet usually celebrates beauty or talks about love in a kind of abstract way, or it's often a question of unrequited love, but not here. It's a celebration of beauty in this case. So there's something a little artificial about the sonnet too, and we kind of know what the themes will be usually before it's written, although many modern poets have tried to change that and include other kinds of content in the sonnet. Mostly it hasn't been very successful because it's a form that was designed to speak about particular things. Yes, so maybe we can say these are ideas which are not so easy to talk about. And so Shakespeare uses a lot of imagery in the poem. The sun is an eye in the sky, sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. So it's also a face in the sky, and the golden face is covered by clouds. And then later in the 3rd quatrain, we read about how death shall not brag that thou wanderest in his shade. So here is personification, death personified, the idea that the loved one is so beautiful that death would brag about it if he was able to take his soul to the underworld. However, there is that artificiality. Obviously, the loved one will be dead in the future, and it's only in an artificial way in the poem that his or her, in this case, is probably about a man, as most people know. Um, it's only through the poem that the loved one's beauty will continue to exist. So it's artificial, but then this kind of poem, the sonnet, is really made for artificiality. It often works on the basis of a build-up of logic, which is then overturned at the end with some kind of false logic, something illogical, but including an emotional truth, and the emotional truth seems stronger than the logic. Typical of a sonnet, typical of the best poets who write sonnets. Of course, Shakespeare took the form from the Italians, Petrarch and Dante, and changed the format a little bit to make it more suitable to the English language and possibly his own skills. What else can we say about the sonnet? Well, it's usually has what is called an octave and a sestet. So the octave is the first 8 lines when the problem is stated and situation described, and then the last 6 lines bring a solution or answer the question. In this case, the original question, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, is obviously negated by everything that follows. So no, there is no need to compare the loved one to a summer's day, because the loved one is better than a summer's day and will live forever in the poem. Summer's day, days of summer come and go, but the beauty of the loved one will remain forever. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. So, yeah, we can see then that in a poem like this, Shakespeare has knowledge of the past tradition of the sonnet, the kind of things that are written about in sonnets, the things, kind of subjects which are suitable for a sonnet. He knows about the rhyme scheme of sonnets. He knows about the meter of language. He can arrange his words to fit into iambic pentameter. And sorry, somebody passing by very loud outside. He can fit his ideas to iambic pentameter, this stressed unit, and it's not that easy actually. If somebody thinks about it, they will often find it very difficult. It's not the only meter in the English language. In fact, there are many dactyls and spondies, all sorts of things, some of which we will look at in later videos. But iambic pentameter is probably the most popular and the most natural and conversational in the English language. But yes, anyone who wants to write a sonnet really needs to know all these things. And it's the same with lyrics or ballads or even free verse. T.S. Eliot said that T.S. Eliot said that free verse doesn't exist for anyone who is a good craftsman. And what he meant was that any poet really is thinking about the structure of the words all the time and how they fit together. And you can't not know the rules. You can know the rules and break them, but it's going to show up in what you do if you don't know the rules. Say let's say the blues lines I quoted from Robert Johnson before. Well, he knows very well the rules of his own blues, and the last line that follows the two repeated lines of each verse. So he's been doing that for so long. He may not have studied it consciously, but he's been listening to this kind of blues all his life, and he's been writing it now for a long time, and he's become an expert. He can, what he writes sometimes rises to the level of high poetry, as in the example I quoted earlier. And there are lots of song lyrics which rise to the level of poetry. Bob Dylan has some great poetry in his song lyrics, I think. It's not always poetry because it's different if there is going to be melody with the words, and often the melody has to take the main is given the main emphasis, and it's not necessary to have really great words, but sometimes the words become very important and rise to the level of poetry. So one of the things I want to do in these videos is to see the relationships between the different ways in which people use words in a condensed way with imagery to talk about difficult or unusual things, and that happens a lot in songs. So there will be editions on song lyrics as well, and how many of them do rise to the level of poetry. So we haven't really come to any conclusion about the definition of what poetry is, but it's something about language, and it's something about emotion, and it's something about trying to express difficult concepts. The difficult concepts are not philosophical, or not purely philosophical. There has to be an emotional attachment or interest for someone to write a poem. Like if you try to describe God, you might try to do it in a poem, because if you try to do it in prose, it's very difficult. It's very difficult in a poem too. So, but maybe it's easier if you can compare things and say one thing is like another thing. Imagery is so important to poetry. Mostly poets use similes and metaphors. Similes, where you say one thing is like another thing. She is like a rose. A metaphor, where one thing is seen in terms of another thing. So she is a rose. And both are fine, and are used all the time by poets. So this is something else which someone who writes poetry needs to be good at: the writing of imagery. As we saw, the Shakespeare poem was full of very effective imagery. So poet has to be competent in all these fields. And we're not just talking about sonnets, we're talking about all kinds of poetry. If somebody writes free verse, if somebody writes lyrics or ballads, or even song lyrics that come to the level of poetry, need to know what has come before and study it very carefully in order to reach a high level. So I don't know, poetry then, it's the expression of difficult concepts in language. That's, well, it's the emotional expression of abstract concepts in language, perhaps. It's very difficult to come to a single definition of poetry, and no one has managed it, and I won't either. We see what poetry is by reading lots of examples of poetry. So in this first video, I just wanted to emphasize how uh, important it is to get to know the rules of the sort of things that you want to write about if you want to be a poet. If you just want to study or read poetry, then it's the same thing. You really have to know about where the poetry is coming from, what the rules are, what the structures are, where the, this poet has been influenced by past poets. Um, so, having looked, having made this general survey of poetry, in the next videos I will look at some specific poems, not sonnets, different kinds of poems to illustrate more points and some of the things that have been said in this video today. So I hope it's been useful, and I think for today I'm going to end the stream there, but there will be more videos up soon, so please keep looking at this channel, and I hope that if you are studying poetry for university or in high school, that these videos will perhaps make it a little easier for you, and we might even cover some poems that you actually study on those courses. So thank you very much, and remember the link to uh, the podcast is below, and there will be more videos up soon. Thanks a lot.